Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little uncomfortable. We're talking about the drugs sitting quietly in your medicine cabinet, the ones with the friendly pastel labels and the unreadable inserts folded 17 times into a square the size of a postage stamp. Not the street corner trenchcoat kind. I mean the real ones, the ones your doctor prescribed with a confident nod, the ones advertised during the news with soft piano music and suspiciously fast-talking voiceovers listing side effects that include death as if it's a mild inconvenience. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And before anything else, a genuine thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. You slid into the comments with this idea, and honestly, it stopped me mid-scroll. This channel only grows because of people like you, and I don't take that lightly. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It is always somehow 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. We're also now on Spotify, by the way. Link is in the description if you want to bring this voice somewhere the earbuds fit a little better. Now, dim those lights, turn on a fan for that soft white noise, pull that blanket up. Maybe check that the lid is on your pill bottle before you drift off, because tonight we are going deep. Let's pause and really sit with some questions you've probably never asked. Have you ever actually read the warning label on your Xanax? Like, all of it? Did you know that one of the most commonly prescribed painkillers in America is technically a cousin of heroin? Did you know that a drug invented to help soldiers stay awake is now being crushed up by college students at 2 a.m. before a macroeconomics exam? Did you know there's a sleeping pill so potent it once caused people to sleepwalk, sleep drive, and in at least one case, sleep cook a full meal with no memory of any of it? Could a tiny white pill really rewire your brain without asking permission? And if doctors know all of this, and they do, why is the prescription pad still moving quite so fast? Congratulations, you've just woken up inside the American pharmaceutical system. The year is somewhere between 1950 and right now. You have a prescription, a copay, a slightly nervous feeling you can't quite name, and a bottle of something that is either going to help you enormously or introduce you to side effects no one bothered to mention at checkout. Good luck. Try not to mix it with grapefruit. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is where things start to quietly go wrong. A prescription drug, in the cleanest possible definition, is a medication deemed too powerful, too complex, or too prone to misuse to be handed out freely over a pharmacy counter. The idea is that a trained professional, a doctor, a nurse, practitioner, someone who spent a decade in school and another 5 years in residency eating vending machine sandwiches, evaluates you, weighs the risks, and decides whether a particular drug is appropriate for your particular situation. Noble in theory, airtight in theory. The kind of system that sounds perfectly sensible until you realize that in the United States alone, over 4 billion, that's billion with a B, prescriptions are filled every single year, which works out to roughly 12 prescriptions for every man, woman and child in the country, including the children, including the infants, including your neighbour who swears he's never taken anything stronger than a vitamin and somehow still has 3 bottles of something unpronounceable in his bathroom cabinet. That number has been climbing for decades, quietly and steadily, like a well-dressed problem nobody wants to point at directly. Now, to be fair, this is not entirely sinister. Human beings live longer now than at almost any point in recorded history. Longer lives mean more chronic conditions, more high blood pressure, more diabetes, more arthritis, more of everything that accumulates when the body has been operating for 70 years on a diet that occasionally included gas station sushi. Prescription drugs manage those conditions. They prevent strokes. They keep hearts beating in rhythm. They allow people to wake up, function, and go about their day without being ambushed by pain or illness before 9 a.m. That is genuinely remarkable. That is, in many ways, a triumph of modern medicine. But here is where the definition starts to bend. A prescription drug is, by design, a controlled thing, controlled by expertise, controlled by evidence, controlled by a system of checks that is supposed to separate treatment from commerce. And yet, the same bottle of pills that genuinely saves one person's life can, in a different context, a different body, a different set of circumstances, quietly begin to do the opposite. The line between treatment and harm is not always printed clearly on the label. Sometimes it's in the fine print. Sometimes it's in the fast-talking 30-second window at the end of the television commercial, the one where the narrator rattles through side effects while golden retrievers run in slow motion across a sun-drenched meadow. Think about the last time you were handed a prescription. Did the doctor explain the mechanism, what the drug actually does inside your body at a chemical level? Did they explain what the withdrawal looks like if you ever need to stop? Did they mention that certain combinations with common foods or other medications could quietly undermine the whole enterprise? Probably not in full. Probably not because they didn't care, but because the appointment was 15 minutes long and the waiting room was full and the electronic record system was doing something unhelpful again. This is not a story about bad doctors. Most doctors are doing their genuine best inside a system that was not designed primarily around their best. It's a story about a category of substances so powerful that they can reverse a disease and trigger one in the same week, and about a culture that has become so accustomed to their presence that we have largely stopped noticing how extraordinary and how consequential that is. So before we talk about specific drugs, before we get into what Xanax actually does to your brain, or why fentanyl operates in micrograms, let's just sit here for a moment with the strangeness of it all. 4 billion prescriptions, 12 per person, a system designed to protect you that occasionally forgets what protecting you looks like. The beginning is always the most important part, and for a remarkable number of people, the beginning was a prescription. Everything else came after. Before the 1960s, the United States had surprisingly few guardrails on what could be sold to the public. As medicine, cocaine was in your soda, heroin was in your cough syrup, opium was in your teething powder for infants, and nobody was particularly alarmed. These weren't underground products sold in back alleys. They were on pharmacy shelves and catalogues, advertised in newspapers alongside face cream and horse feed. The assumption was essentially, if it works, sell it. If people get addicted, well, that's a matter of personal constitution. Then came thalidomide, and everything changed. Thalidomide was a sedative developed in West Germany and introduced in the late 1950s, prescribed widely across Europe and Canada to pregnant women suffering from morning sickness. It worked beautifully for that. It also, quietly and catastrophically, interfered with fetal development. Thousands of babies were born with severe limb deformities, shortened or absent arms and legs, conditions that had been vanishingly rare before the drug. The connection took longer to establish than it should have, in part because pharmaceutical companies did not rush to find it. The United States was spared the worst of the thalidomide disaster largely by accident, and largely because of one woman, a Canadian-born FDA reviewer named Frances Kelsey, who had been on the job for less than a month when the application to approve thalidomide landed on her desk. She reviewed the data. She found it thin. She asked for more. The manufacturer pushed back. She held her position. She was described at the time by company representatives as obstructionist. She was later awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by John F. Kennedy. History has a way of sorting out who was right. The thalidomide disaster sparked sweeping reforms. Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment in 1962, which for the first time required pharmaceutical companies to prove not just that their drugs were safe, but that they were effective. Clinical trials became mandatory. The FDA grew teeth. It was, By any measure, a significant step forward, and also, as it turned out, only the beginning of a much longer and considerably more complicated story about what safe actually means. Because here is the thing about drug safety that tends to get lost in the story we tell about progress. Drugs are approved based on clinical trials that last months, sometimes a few years, in carefully selected populations. The real world is not a clinical trial. The real world includes people on 10 other medications, people with conditions that excluded them from the trial, people who take higher doses than studied, people who take the drug for decades when it was only tested for weeks. Post-market surveillance, the process of monitoring a drug's safety after it reaches the public, has historically been underfunded, under-prioritized, and structurally incentivized toward optimism. Vioxx, a painkiller approved in 1999, was withdrawn in 2004 after it became clear the drug significantly increased the risk of heart attack and stroke. An estimated 55,000 people may have died from cardiovascular events linked to the drug during the years it was on the market. Rizulin, a diabetes medication, fen-phen, a weight loss drug, Baycol, a cholesterol drug. The list of drugs approved, then recalled, then occasionally reapproved in modified form is longer than most people realize, and longer than any drug company has been enthusiastic about advertising. None of this means the approval process is worthless. It means the approval process is the beginning of knowing whether a drug is safe, not the end. The label that says FDA approved is meaningful. It is not the same as comprehensively understood. And for the people who took a drug in good faith, based on good information, and experienced something no clinical trial predicted, the distinction matters enormously. Here is something the history books don't emphasize enough. Every major opioid painkiller in your medicine cabinet is, in a very real pharmacological sense, a relative of the opium poppy, not a distant cousin, more like a sibling. The kind of sibling who changed their name, got a law degree and started wearing a white coat, but still has the same eyes. The chain goes like this. Opium comes from the poppy plant, specifically from the milky sap of the seed pods of Papaver somniferum. It has been used for thousands of years. The ancient Sumerians called it the joy plant in texts dating back over 5,000 years. The ancient Egyptians cultivated it. The ancient Greeks wrote about it. Arab traders spread it across the known world. It was for most of human history the most effective pain-relieving substance that existed, and human beings were not particularly confused about why. In the early 1800s, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Serturner isolated the active compound in opium and named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was more powerful than raw opium, more predictable in its effects, and, in an early preview of a pattern that would repeat many times over the next 2 centuries, was initially promoted as a safer, non-habit-forming alternative to its predecessor. It was prescribed widely during the American Civil War, administered to wounded soldiers on both sides, and left a generation of veterans with what was then gently called soldier's disease. Then came heroin. In 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company, the same company that gave the world aspirin, synthesized diacetyl morphine, named it heroin from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, and marketed it enthusiastically as a safer, non-addictive alternative to morphine. It was available over the counter. It was prescribed for coughs. It was given to children. It was briefly considered a medical triumph. You already know how that ended. The point is not that the scientists were stupid. The point is that this is the template. Every time a new opioid compound enters the market, it arrives wearing the same promise. More effective, safer, less prone to abuse than what came before. Oxycodone was synthesized in Germany in 1916, hydrocodone in 1921, fentanyl in 1960, oxymorphone, hydromorphone, buprenorphine, to pentadol, each one a variation on a molecular theme that the poppy plant discovered long before any of us. What all opioids share is a mechanism. They bind to opioid receptors in the brain and body, particularly the mu receptor, and in doing so they block pain signals, trigger the release of dopamine, and produce a state of relief and, depending on the dose, warmth and well-being that the brain finds extremely difficult to forget. The brain is not judging. The brain is not aware it is supposed to be careful. The brain just knows that something made it feel better than it has ever felt, and it would very much like that to happen again. Understanding that mechanism, really sitting with it, is the only honest way to understand why opioid addiction isn't a character flaw or a failure of will. It is a predictable neurological response to a compound the brain was never meant to encounter in these concentrations. The poppy figured out how to speak the brain's language a long time ago. Everything that followed was just us borrowing the vocabulary. If you want to understand how a prescription painkiller became the engine of the deadliest drug crisis in American history, you have to start not in a back alley but in a boardroom. Not in the kinds of rooms that show up in documentaries about addiction, fluorescent lit, linoleum floored, populated by people who look like they've been through something. In a room with mahogany furniture and charitable foundation plaques on the wall and framed photographs of donated hospital wings. In 1996, Purdue Pharma, a privately held pharmaceutical company owned by the Sackler family, has launched OxyContin, an extended-release formulation of oxycodone, with a marketing campaign of staggering ambition and, as later investigations would reveal, staggering dishonesty. The drug was real. The need was real. Under-treatment of chronic pain was a genuine medical concern, and the 1990s saw a significant push within medicine to take pain more seriously as a vital sign. Purdue walked into that opening with extraordinary confidence. Sales representatives were trained to emphasize that the drug's extended-release formula, which delivered oxycodone over 12 hours rather than all at once, made it less addictive than shorter-acting opioids. That claim was not supported by the available science. Purdue knew this. Internal documents, unsealed through litigation years later, showed that the company was aware of reports of addiction and abuse early in the drug's history and chose to minimize, contest, and in some cases actively suppress that information. What followed was one of the most aggressive pharmaceutical marketing campaigns in American history. Purdue sent sales representatives to doctors' offices across the country, paying particular attention to high-prescribing physicians in regions with high rates of physical labor injuries, where patients came in with backs wrecked by construction or mining or farming and needed something for the pain. Representatives brought gifts, dinners, and speaking fees. They brought a message. This drug is safe. This drug is appropriate for long-term use. This drug will not cause the problems you've been trained to worry about with opioids. Prescriptions climbed. The drug became the best-selling opioid in American history. And in communities across Appalachia, the Rust Belt, rural New England, and suburban America, something else was happening too. People prescribed OxyContin were discovering that the drug's extended-release mechanism could be defeated by crushing the tablet, releasing all 12 hours of oxycodone at once, producing an intensity of effect the drug was designed not to deliver. People were becoming addicted. People were dying. Purdue tracked this. Internal data showed the company was monitoring pill mill activity, doctors prescribing at extraordinarily high rates, and in many cases chose not to act on that information or acted in ways designed to protect market share rather than patients. The Sackler family received roughly $10 to $12 billion in dividends from Purdue between 1996 and the company's bankruptcy in 2019. When the lawsuits finally came from states, cities, counties, and individuals, Perdue's lawyers argued the company had acted in good faith within the regulatory framework. The families of the overdose dead had a different way of describing it. The mahogany rooms and the charitable plaques didn't change what was in the bottles, or what happened to the people who opened them. Percocet sounds almost friendly, doesn't it? It has the kind of name you'd give a golden retriever or a pleasant Italian pastry. Something warm, something domestically comforting, something you'd reach for on a rough day without too much deliberation. It is not those things. It is a combination of oxycodone, a powerful synthetic opioid, and acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, and the marriage of those two substances inside one small oval pill is where the complexity begins, and, for a meaningful number of people, where a particular kind of trouble quietly starts. The oxycodone half of the equation handles pain by binding to opioid receptors in the central nervous system, triggering a cascade that includes reduced pain perception and, importantly, a release of dopamine that can produce not just relief, but a warmth and sense of well-being that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has never felt it, and genuinely difficult to forget for someone who has. For people in acute, severe pain, post-surgical, post-injury, post-procedure, this is the entire point. The drug works. It works well. For legitimate short-term use in acute pain, Percocet does what it is supposed to do, with a reliability that has made it one of the most prescribed drugs in America. The acetaminophen component was added partly to enhance the pain-killing effect, and partly, historically, as a deterrent, the thinking being that someone trying to abuse the drug by taking more than prescribed would be limited by the toxicity of the acetaminophen before reaching truly dangerous opioid doses. It was a reasonable theory. It was also not entirely how things played out in practice, because people in the grip of physical dependence are not reliably making careful pharmacological calculations about which of the two active ingredients in their pill is going to fail their liver first. Because here is the thing about acetaminophen that most people don't know. It is the leading cause of acute liver failure in the United States. Not in overdose cases involving bad intent, in cases involving ordinary people who were taking it as directed, in multiple products, without realizing they were doubling or tripling up. Percocet contains acetaminophen. So does NyQuil. So does Theraflu. So does Vicodin. So does the Tylenol PM you took separately for your headache. The liver processes acetaminophen by producing a toxic byproduct, a compound called NAPQI, which is normally neutralized by an antioxidant called glutathione. When there's too much acetaminophen, the glutathione runs out, and the NAPQI begins destroying liver cells. It does this quietly, without pain at first. By the time symptoms appear, the damage is frequently severe. And then there is the opioid side of things. Regular use of Percocet, not abuse, not diversion, just regular prescribed use over weeks, can produce physical dependence. The opioid receptors downregulate. Baseline pain perception shifts. The dose that provided relief last week provides less relief this week. This is not a moral failure. This is the pharmacology doing exactly what the pharmacology does, in exactly the direction that everyone with access to the data already knew it would go. The bedside table version of this story is the most common one. A surgery, a prescription, a recovery that goes fine, and then a decision point. Stop the medication and feel the withdrawal symptoms you weren't warned about, or call the doctor and ask for one more refill and then another. Most people get through it without incident. Some don't. The pill is the same either way. There is a moment in the opioid crisis timeline where the numbers stop being bad and start being staggering, and that moment is fentanyl. Not when fentanyl was invented, it has been around since the 1960s, synthesized by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen, and used in surgical anesthesia for decades. A compound valued precisely because of how fast it worked, and how completely it could eliminate pain. Fentanyl in a medical setting, administered carefully in precise doses by trained professionals watching your vital signs, is a genuinely remarkable tool. That is not the conversation we're about to have. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid, meaning it was created entirely in a laboratory, bearing no direct botanical ancestry, no poppies, no fields, no centuries of agricultural history. It is approximately 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine by weight. Let's make that tangible. A therapeutic dose of morphine for pain management is measured in milligrams, tens of milligrams sometimes. A lethal dose of fentanyl can be measured in micrograms. 2 micrograms per kilogram of body weight is a typical surgical anesthetic dose. The margin between the dose that sedates and the dose that stops respiration is narrow, terrifyingly, almost abstractly narrow. A few grains, less than a snowflake, less than a fingerprint, when fentanyl began appearing in the illicit drug supply in significant quantities, first in the early 2000s, then explosively from around 2013 onward. It did not arrive with labels or dosage information. It arrived pressed into counterfeit pills designed to look exactly like pharmaceutical oxycodone or Xanax. It arrived mixed into heroin. It arrived dusted onto other substances by suppliers who either didn't know or didn't care what a microscopic miscalculation would mean for the person on the other end of the transaction. And the person on the other end had no way to know it was there. This is the thing that changed the overdose math entirely. Before fentanyl dominated the supply, an opioid overdose was dangerous, sometimes fatal but often survivable. There was time, sometimes, for someone to notice, to call for help, for naloxone to arrive. Fentanyl can stop respiration in minutes. It can kill someone who has been using opioids for years, who has a significant tolerance, who knows exactly what they're doing because the dose they encountered was simply not the dose they expected. The concept of tolerance becomes meaningless when the potency of what you're taking is invisible. By 2023, synthetic opioids, primarily fentanyl, were involved in the vast majority of overdose deaths in the United States. The drugs were in the heroin supply. They were in the cocaine supply. They were in the methamphetamine supply. People who had never taken an opioid in their lives were dying of fentanyl overdoses because the drug had found its way into substances that had no historical relationship with it. The emergency room doctors and first responders who began seeing this pattern in the data watched the numbers climb with a particular kind of dread, the kind that comes from understanding exactly why it's happening and having very little ability to stop it from the direction they were standing. Fentanyl in legitimate medical use remains an important tool. Fentanyl in the illicit supply is a different substance entirely, not because the molecule changed, but because the molecule was never designed to exist outside the conditions of control that make its potency survivable. In 1960, a chemist named Leo Sternbach at Hoffmann La Roche was cleaning out his laboratory, genuinely actually cleaning, the kind of administrative tidying that most chemists avoid, when he came across a compound he had synthesized years earlier and set aside without testing. He decided, almost as an afterthought, to run it through the standard battery of pharmacological tests. The results were unexpected. The compound produced profound relaxation, sedation, and relief from anxiety in laboratory animals. It was unlike anything then available. Sternbach had stumbled onto the benzodiazepine class of drugs, and the first one, Librium, reached the market in 1960. Its refined successor, Valium, followed in 1963. Valium became, through the 1960s and 70s, the most prescribed drug in the United States for over a decade. It was prescribed for anxiety, for insomnia, for muscle spasms, for the vague, unnamed tension that doctors recognized in their patients and didn't quite have language for yet. It was prescribed heavily to women, so heavily that a Rolling Stones song, released in 1966, called it "Mother's Little Helper," a phrase that was meant at the time as casual social commentary and reads now as something considerably more pointed. The diazepam prescription was a way of managing the particular distress of women in a culture that didn't always offer other options, and it was written by the millions. Benzodiazepines work by enhancing the activity of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. GABA essentially slows things down. It dampens neural activity. Benzos amplify that effect, producing their characteristic calm. The anxiety quietens, the muscles relax, the racing thoughts slow to a manageable pace. For someone in the grip of a panic attack, or withdrawing from alcohol, or living with a seizure disorder, this effect is not trivial. It can be, without exaggeration, life-saving. The problem is the pharmacology cannot distinguish between therapeutic use and the slow patient development of physical dependence. With regular use over weeks, the brain adapts. It downregulates GABA receptors, essentially recalibrating to account for the drug's constant enhancement of inhibitory signaling. The result is tolerance, the same dose producing less effect, and physical dependence, meaning that the absence of the drug now produces the opposite of its intended effect: anxiety, agitation, insomnia, hypersensitivity. The symptoms that sent someone to the doctor in the first place return, often intensified. This is called rebound, and it has kept a great many people on benzodiazepines long past the point when their doctor intended them to stop. What makes this particularly consequential is that benzo withdrawal, unlike opioid withdrawal, can be directly fatal. Seizures are a documented risk of abrupt discontinuation, particularly in long-term high-dose users. The brain, deprived suddenly of the compound that has been supplementing its inhibitory signaling for months or years, can become dangerously overexcitable. This is why medically supervised tapering, slow, careful, often very slow, is the standard of care for discontinuing benzodiazepines. And yet, historically, patients were often handed prescriptions with refills and no exit plan, and found out about the exit difficulty when they tried to make one. Xanax, generic name alprazolam, arrived in 1981, and it has barely left the cultural conversation since. It is a benzodiazepine, faster acting than Valium, with a shorter half-life, meaning it kicks in faster and clears the system. Faster, which was, when it was developed, considered a significant advantage. It was approved initially for panic disorder and anxiety, and in both applications it works with a speed and reliability that, for people who suffer from acute incapacitating anxiety, is genuinely transformative. There is a particular quality to a panic attack: the racing heart, the chest that won't expand, the absolute certainty that something is catastrophically wrong even when nothing is, that Xanax can dissolve in under half an hour. For people who live with panic disorder, that is not a small thing. That is a functional existence rather than a managed retreat from one. By 2010, alprazolam was the most prescribed psychiatric medication in the United States. By 2013, it was among the top 5 most prescribed drugs in the country, full stop. Those numbers tell a story not just about anxiety, though anxiety is genuinely prevalent, genuinely debilitating, and genuinely undertreated in the American healthcare system, but about a drug that became the default response to a category of human experience that is extraordinarily common. The short half-life that made Xanax seem clinically elegant is also, pharmacologically, part of its problem. A short half-life means the drug leaves the body relatively quickly, which means the withdrawal, the neurological rebound, comes faster and harder than it does with longer-acting benzodiazepines like Valium. Interdose withdrawal, where symptoms begin to return between doses, can begin within hours for regular users. This creates a cycle that is difficult to distinguish. From the inside from the original anxiety, the drug wears off, anxiety returns, the patient takes another dose, the anxiety resolves, and the brain quietly notches up its baseline excitability another degree to compensate. Abrupt discontinuation of Xanax in a physically dependent user can trigger seizures, not in everyone, not even in most, but in some, and with enough reliability that the FDA's own prescribing guidelines recommend against abrupt cessation after extended use. This is printed in the prescribing information. It is not printed on the bottle. It is not discussed in the 15-minute appointment that sent most people home with their first prescription. What has also not always been adequately communicated is the drug's interaction with other central nervous system depressants, particularly alcohol and opioids. The combination of a benzodiazepine and an opioid significantly increases the risk of fatal respiratory depression. Both drug classes slow breathing. Together, they can slow it to a stop. The FDA issued a black box warning about this combination in 2016, noting that tens of thousands of people had died in combinations involving both. The combination remains common. The co-prescription of opioids and benzodiazepines, despite the warning, continued at high rates for years after the label. Change. Ambien, generic name Zolpidem, was introduced in 1992, and it arrived wearing the reasonable, reassuring face of progress. It was not a benzodiazepine, technically. It belonged to a new class of drugs called non-benzodiazepine sedative hypnotics, ZED drugs, colloquially, because so many of them begin with ZED. It worked on GABA receptors in a similar way to benzos, but with, the manufacturers argued, greater selectivity, targeting the specific receptor subtypes involved in sleep rather than the broader range of receptors that produce benzos' more sweeping sedative effects. The result, in theory, was a drug that helped you fall asleep without the same dependency risk, the same next-day sedation, the same problems. In the short term, for short-term insomnia, it largely delivered. Ambien became one of the most widely prescribed drugs in American history. Tens of millions of Americans took it regularly through the 90s and 2000s, busy people, stressed people, people who had tried everything else, people who simply lay awake at night while their brain ran through an itemized list of everything it had been too polite to mention during the day. It worked. It got people to sleep. And then things got interesting. Reports began accumulating of what were clinically termed complex sleep-related behaviors. Sleepwalking, first, which had been noted with other sedatives before and wasn't immediately alarming. Then sleep driving. Then sleep cooking. People waking to find evidence of elaborate meals prepared in their kitchens with no memory of making them. Then sleep eating. People consuming food during the night, occasionally food they would not have chosen while conscious, with no recollection of doing so. A woman in Australia successfully used Ambien as a partial defence in a criminal case, arguing she had committed the act while in a drug-induced sleep state. Cases mounted. The behaviours weren't rare adverse events, they were a recognisable pattern across a large population. In 2013, the FDA required manufacturers to cut the recommended dosage in half, specifically and explicitly for women who metabolized Zolpidem more slowly than men and were being found, in studies, to have blood levels the following morning high enough to impair driving. This was not a small revision. This was the FDA acknowledging that the standard recommended dose of a widely prescribed medication had, for a segment of the population, been too high for over 20 years. The drug had been on the market for 2 decades before that correction was made. Lunesta, esopicolone, arrived in 2004 and was approved for long-term use in a way that Ambien was not, distinguishing it commercially in a crowded sleep aid market. Its own issues emerged over time, including a characteristic metallic or bitter taste that persisted into the following day, and concerns about next-day cognitive impairment. Both drugs, remain widely prescribed. Both work. Both work for a while. What neither of them does is address the underlying reasons most people cannot sleep, which are behavioral, psychological, environmental, and physiological, in ways that no pill has ever successfully managed to touch. Adderall is amphetamine. Let's just say that clearly in the plain light, without the clinical softening, and let it settle for a moment before we go any further. The active ingredient in Adderall, the thing that is doing the work inside your central nervous system when you take it, is a combination of amphetamine salts, not an amphetamine-adjacent compound, not something that behaves like amphetamine in some circumstances. Amphetamine. The same basic molecular architecture that was given to American and British soldiers in World War II to keep them functional through extended operations, that powered long-haul truckers through the 1950s under the name Bennies, and that, in a slightly different configuration, became the street drug known as speed, or in crystal form methamphetamine. That is not an argument against its medical use. It is context without which the medical use doesn't fully make sense. For individuals with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, Adderall produces what its prescribers describe, accurately, as a paradoxical calming effect. In a brain with ADHD, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for planning, impulse control, sustained attention, and what we'd broadly call executive function, operates with lower baseline dopamine and norepinephrine activity than average. The result, in daily life, is difficulty maintaining focus, difficulty filtering irrelevant stimuli, difficulty completing tasks that don't provide immediate reward, and a frustrating disconnect between intention and action. Adderall floods the synapse with dopamine and norepinephrine. The prefrontal cortex gets the chemical signal it needs to function. Attention stabilizes. Impulsivity decreases. For people who have spent their lives struggling with a brain that doesn't quite cooperate with what they're trying to do, this experience is by many accounts remarkable. The prescription data is where things get complicated. Adderall prescriptions in the United States increased by roughly 3,000% between 1990 and 2012. The diagnosis of ADHD expanded in children, then in adults, then in college students, then in professionals, then in everyone who sat across from a prescriber and described the experience of living in a distracted, fast-moving, notification-saturated modern world, and found that the description matched the checklist. Some of those people genuinely had ADHD that had gone undiagnosed for years, some did not. In a brain without ADHD, a brain where prefrontal cortex dopamine levels are already within the normal range, Adderall does not produce calm. It produces stimulation, focus that feels laser sharp, productivity that feels effortless, an ability to sit down and work for 6 hours on something you would normally avoid entirely. This is why the drug found its way into universities, into finance, into any high-pressure environment where output was rewarded and rest was not. And the brain that experienced this and then experienced the crash when the drug wore off, and then wondered whether it could have that feeling again, that brain was not broken or weak. That brain was behaving exactly the way a brain behaves when it encounters a compound that produces more dopamine than it was ever meant to encounter in that quantity. The lesson, as with the opioids, is that the pharmacology does not ask about your intentions. It just does what it does. There is a particular quality to the stimulant crash that people who have used Adderall, Ritalin, Vivancy, or any amphetamine-adjacent drug will recognize immediately, and that everyone else will find difficult to appreciate until they've felt it personally. It does not feel like ordinary tiredness. Ordinary tiredness is a soft thing, the weight behind the eyes at the end of a long day, the body kindly suggesting that you might want to consider horizontal. The stimulant crash is not that. The stimulant crash feels like being briefly lent someone else's brain, a sharper, faster, more capable version. and then having it abruptly repossessed, leaving you with yours again, which now feels inadequate in a way it never quite did before. It arrives a few hours after the drug's peak effect, sometimes gradually, sometimes like a wall you didn't see until you were already through it. The focus that felt effortless dissolves. The motivation that seemed bottomless reveals itself as borrowed. Mood drops, not always dramatically but reliably, into a flatness that is less like sadness and more like the absence of colour. Tasks that felt manageable an hour ago now feel like trying to push furniture through deep water, and underneath all of it, a fatigue so specific it has a texture, heavy, grey and faintly irritable. For people with ADHD taking stimulants as prescribed, this come down as a known variable, something to be managed, adjusted, discussed with a prescriber. The dosage and timing of medication can be calibrated to minimize the trough at the end of the day. It is not comfortable, but it is manageable within a medical framework designed to account for it. The problem is that a significant portion of stimulant use, particularly in college environments, professional settings, and anywhere that productivity is rewarded and rest is not, exists entirely outside that framework. The person who took Adderall without a prescription to get through an all-nighter has no calibrated dosage, no medical follow-up, and no particular plan for what happens when the drug wears off at 2 a.m. with the paper still half written. The solution in that situation is almost always the same. Take another dose. Push through the crash with more of the substance that caused it. This works, in the short term, in the same way that taking a painkiller for a withdrawal headache works. It resolves the immediate symptom while extending the underlying problem further down the road. Sleep deprivation begins to accumulate. Appetite, already suppressed by stimulant use. Amphetamines are potent appetite suppressants, which is why they were marketed as diet pills in the 1950s and 60s, fails to prompt eating, and the caloric debt compounds alongside the sleep debt. Then there is the cardiovascular system, which has been running at an elevated pace throughout all of this, and has not been consulted about any of the decisions being made on its behalf. Amphetamines increase heart rate and blood pressure. In a young, healthy person, this is generally tolerable at therapeutic doses. In someone who's been taking stimulants irregularly, in uncontrolled doses without sleep, with the stress of a deadline and possibly with caffeine layered on top, the cardiovascular math becomes less comfortable. Cases of stimulant-associated cardiac events in young adults are rare in absolute numbers. They're not rare enough to be dismissed. And then there is the psychological dimension, the one that tends to emerge over longer timeframes and is therefore easier to miss. Regular stimulant use without medical supervision can produce anxiety that outlasts the dose, irritability that lingers into days of non-use, and in some cases, particularly at high doses, a stimulant-induced paranoia that resolves with cessation but takes its time doing so. The brain that has been flooded with dopamine on Tuesday finds its natural dopamine signalling slightly dimmer on Wednesday. This recalibration is temporary, but temporary can feel, from the inside, like a very long time. The stimulant crash is not a moral story, it is a pharmacological one. And the pharmacology, as always, does not negotiate. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are the most commonly prescribed antidepressants in the world, and almost certainly the most prescribed psychiatric medications in the history of medicine. Prozac, Zoloft, Lexapro, Paxil, Celexa, these are household names, words that appear in casual conversation, in song lyrics, in sitcom punchlines, in the way people talk about their brain chemistry, the way an earlier generation talked about their nerves. They are drugs that have genuinely changed and in real and measurable ways saved lives. That needs to be said clearly, and it needs to be said first, before anything else. because the complexity of the conversation that follows should not be mistaken for dismissal of what these medications have meant to people who needed them. Depression is a real illness. It is biological, neurological, and for people in the depths of it, genuinely dangerous. It is not sadness, it is not a bad week, it is a state in which the brain's capacity to experience pleasure, motivation, connection, and hope is systematically impaired in ways that do not respond to positive thinking, good advice, or the suggestion that you might feel better if you exercise more and spent less time on your phone. When antidepressants work, and they do work, for a meaningful percentage of the people who take them, the experience is one of a flaw reappearing under your feet, something that was absent returning. That is not nothing. That is, for many people, everything. But the story of how these drugs work has been told for several decades in a way that is considerably more confident than the underlying science actually supports. You have almost certainly heard the explanation. Depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, specifically low serotonin, and SSR is work. By blocking the reuptake of serotonin in the synapse, increasing its availability, and correcting that imbalance. This explanation was broadcast in pharmaceutical advertisements, explained in doctors' offices, and repeated so consistently that it became cultural fact. It was clean. It was mechanistic. It translated the complexity of mental illness into something that felt understandable and, crucially, solvable. The problem is that the evidence for the serotonin hypothesis of depression has always been weaker than the confidence with which it was presented. In 2022, a major review published in the journal Molecular Psychiatry examined the accumulated research on serotonin and depression and found no consistent evidence that people with depression have lower serotonin levels or serotonin activity than people without depression. This was not fringe science. This was a comprehensive analysis that landed for many people like a rug being pulled out from under a conversation they thought they understood. What does this mean for the drugs? It means that SSRIs appear to help some people with depression through mechanisms that are not fully understood, and that the explanation we were given for why they work may not be the correct one. This is not the same as saying they don't work. It is saying we may not know why they do. That distinction matters, not for whether to take an antidepressant, which remains a decision between a patient and a prescriber, informed by individual circumstances, but for how we talk about depression, how we understand the brain, and how we make sure the explanation we're offering people about their own minds is honest rather than simply convenient. The gap between what is known and what was sold to the public is the story, and it is a gap worth understanding. Here is something that took the psychiatric establishment an uncomfortably long time to say with clarity. Stopping certain antidepressants, particularly SSRIs and their close relatives the SNRIs, drugs like Effexor, Cymbalta and Pristiq, can produce a withdrawal syndrome that is, for some patients, severe, prolonged and genuinely debilitating. Not for everyone, not even for most, but for a substantial minority of people who have taken these medications for months or years and then attempt to stop, the experience is not gentle. The medical community for a long time had an interesting relationship with the word withdrawal when it came to antidepressants. They preferred the term discontinuation syndrome. The distinction was deliberate. Withdrawal, in clinical and cultural vocabulary, carries associations with addiction, with dependence, with the kind of drug relationship that implies something has gone wrong. Discontinuation syndrome was designed to signal something different. This is a temporary adjustment, a brief recalibration, not a sign of addiction. It would resolve in days, maybe a couple of weeks. Nothing to worry about. For many patients, that framing was simply not accurate. Symptoms of antidepressant discontinuation can include what are colloquially known as brain zaps, sudden, electric shock-like sensations in the head that are among the stranger neurological experiences a person can have while otherwise sitting quietly on their couch. They also include dizziness, nausea, profuse sweating, extreme irritability, sensory hypersensitivity, insomnia, vivid and disturbing dreams, and a return of anxiety and depression that is often more intense than what was present before the medication. These symptoms can begin within days of missing a dose, particularly with shorter-acting drugs like Paxil, whose half-life is short enough that the brain notices its absence quickly and loudly. In documented cases, patients have tapered off antidepressants, not stopped abruptly, tapered slowly and carefully, under medical supervision, reducing the dose by small amounts over months, and still experience severe discontinuation symptoms that lasted not weeks, but months. Some patients have reported symptoms lasting a year or longer. There are online communities numbering in the tens of thousands of people, comparing tapering strategies, sharing what worked, warning about what didn't, and supporting each other through a process that their doctors had frequently told them would be over in a fortnight. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured these drugs were aware from clinical trials that discontinuation symptoms occurred. The question of how prominently and clearly that information was communicated to prescribers and patients is one that has generated significant medical and legal attention over the years. Paroxetine, sold as Paxil, became particularly associated with discontinuation difficulty, to the point where its manufacturer GlaxoSmithKline settled lawsuits in multiple countries related to the inadequacy of its warnings. None of this means antidepressants should be avoided. It means they should be started with awareness that stopping may require more planning, more time, and more support than the prescription label implies. The door in is not always the same size as the door out. Antipsychotics were born in the 1950s as genuine revolutionary medicine. Before their arrival, the treatment of severe mental illness, schizophrenia, acute mania, psychotic breaks was, in institutional settings, frequently barbaric. Patients were restrained physically, sedated with barbiturates into states of near unconsciousness, subjected to insulin shock therapy, or, in the most infamous cases, operated on with an ice pick through the eye socket in a procedure so inadequately supported by evidence that its inventor, Walter Freeman, performed it as outpatient surgery with patients awake in a doctor's chair. When chlorpromazine arrived in the early 1950s and demonstrated that it could calm psychotic symptoms without rendering patients completely unconscious, it was, in the context of what had come before, a revelation. Antipsychotics work primarily by blocking dopamine receptors, particularly D2 receptors, in regions of the brain associated with psychosis. The newer generation, called atypical antipsychotics, and introduced beginning in the 1980s and 90s, also target serotonin receptors and were developed partly to reduce the severe movement side effects, called extrapyramidal symptoms, that plagued the older drugs. They work. For people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, or severe manic episodes, antipsychotics can be the difference between a life with functioning and a life without one. This matters. This is not a small thing. But the prescribing of antipsychotics has expanded far beyond those original applications, and the expansion is where the questions accumulate. These drugs are now prescribed, often off-label, for depression that hasn't responded to antidepressants alone, for generalized anxiety disorder, for insomnia, for PTSD, and for children and adolescents with mood disorders and behavioral issues. Off-label prescribing a drug for a condition it wasn't specifically approved to treat, is legal and sometimes clinically reasonable. What it is not is supported by the same level of evidence as approved indications, and the side effect profiles of antipsychotics are not mild. Weight gain is common, sometimes significant, sometimes dramatic. driven by the drug's effects on metabolic hormones and appetite regulation. Metabolic syndrome, a cluster of conditions including elevated blood sugar, high blood pressure, and unhealthy cholesterol levels, is elevated in people on long-term antipsychotic treatment. Type 2 diabetes risk increases. Movement disorders, including a condition called tardive dyskinesia, involuntary, often irreversible repetitive movements, typically in the face, GI, can develop with extended use and are, in some cases, permanent even after the drug is stopped. The use of antipsychotics in elderly patients with dementia received a black box warning from the FDA in 2005. These drugs increase the risk of death in elderly patients with dementia-related psychosis. Studies showed the risk was real, the mechanism likely cardiovascular or infectious, and the magnitude significant. The prescribing in nursing homes continued at high rates after the warning. The reasons for this are not simple. Dementia-related behavioral disturbance is genuinely difficult to manage. Understaffed facilities have limited alternatives, and chemical sedation is faster and cheaper than behavioral intervention. None of that changes what the data shows. Warfarin, sold most commonly under the brand name Coumadin, has a biographical detail that tends to produce a particular expression on people's faces when they hear it for the first time. It was originally developed as a rat poison. This is not a metaphor or a simplification. Warfarin was synthesized in the 1940s from compounds found in spoiled sweet clover that had been killing cattle by causing them to bleed internally, and it was used commercially as a rodenticide for years before researchers, and notably a US Army soldier who survived an attempted suicide by swallowing rat poison, and prompted the medical community to look more carefully at the compound, established that in controlled lower doses it had therapeutic potential in humans. It prevents blood clots. For people with atrial fibrillation, artificial heart valves, deep vein thrombosis, and pulmonary embolism, blood clots are a genuine, life-threatening risk, and warfarin prevents them reliably when properly managed. It is one of the most effective anticoagulants ever developed. It is also, by consistent measure, one of the most dangerous drugs in routine clinical use, not because it is inherently toxic, but because of what is called the therapeutic window. The range between the dose that prevents clots and the dose that causes uncontrolled bleeding is narrower than almost any other drug prescribed to patients going about their daily lives. The measure used to monitor warfarin therapy is called the INR, International Normalized Ratio, a measure of how long it takes blood to clot. The target range for most patients is between 2 and 3. Below 2, clot risk rises. Above 3, bleeding risk rises. Above 4 or 5, spontaneous internal bleeding becomes a real concern. And this number moves constantly, not because of changes in dose, but because of changes in everything around the dose. Vitamin K intake. Eat a spinach salad you wouldn't normally have, and your clotting can change. Alcohol. A heavy weekend can swing the INR significantly. Infections, changes in thyroid function, starting or stopping almost any other medication. Dozens of common drugs affect warfarin's metabolism, pushing the INR up or down in ways that require dose adjustment. Managing warfarin correctly requires regular blood testing, sometimes weekly, dietary consistency, careful medication reconciliation, and a level of patient engagement that is genuinely demanding over months and years. Newer anticoagulants, dabigatran, rivaroxaban, apixaban, have somewhat simplified the picture for some patients, but warfarin remains widely used, particularly where cost and monitoring infrastructure are concerns. Emergency rooms across the country see warfarin-related bleeding events regularly, in the brain, in the gastrointestinal tract, in places that are not obvious until they are serious. The drug is valuable. The drug is also, in the wrong circumstances, the thing causing the emergency that brought you in. Acetaminophen is the most widely used over-the-counter pain reliever in the world. It is also, in overdose, including accidental overdose, the leading cause of acute liver failure in the United States and the United Kingdom, responsible for roughly half of all cases. These two facts live together in a way that most people never reconcile because they have never heard the second one stated plainly. The assumption, reasonable given how it is sold and how often it's recommended, is that acetaminophen is essentially harmless within any plausible normal use. That assumption is not quite right. The mechanism of toxicity is specific and, once understood, clarifying. The liver processes acetaminophen through multiple pathways. One of those pathways produces a toxic intermediate compound called NAPQI. Under normal circumstances, NAPQI is quickly neutralized by an antioxidant called glutathione that the liver produces. When the dose of acetaminophen is too high, or when glutathione stores are depleted, as they are in people who drink heavily, are malnourished, or have certain medical conditions, NAPQI accumulates and begins destroying liver cells. It does this quietly. In the initial hours after an overdose, there may be no dramatic symptoms. Nausea, perhaps, some malaise. Easy to attribute to something else. By the time the damage becomes symptomatic, jaundice, abdominal pain, confusion, it can be irreversible. The critical wrinkle is that acetaminophen is not in one product, it is in hundreds. It is the active ingredient in Tylenol, obviously, but also in NyQuil, Dayquil, Theraflu, Sudafed PE, Excedrin, Midol, Zylquil, and the majority of combination opioid pain medications, Percocet, Vicodin, Norco, Lortab. It is in most over-the-counter sleep aids. It is in most nighttime cold and flu formulations. A person who takes Tylenol in the morning for a headache, NyQuil at night for a cold, and a prescribed Percocet for their back pain in the afternoon is taking 3 separate doses of acetaminophen, possibly approaching or exceeding the daily maximum of 4 grams, without necessarily registering that they are doing so, because none of those 3 products leads with acetaminophen on the front of the box. The FDA has strengthened labeling requirements over the years and lowered the maximum recommended daily dose from 4 grams to 3 for regular use. Prescription opioid acetaminophen combinations were reformulated to reduce per-tablet acetaminophen content. These were meaningful changes. They were also changes that arrived after decades of the drug being omnipresent in American medicine cabinets, after years of emergency room physicians watching the toxicity cases accumulate, and after a cultural investment in the idea of acetaminophen as essentially a background noise of medicine, harmless enough to give to children, safe enough to recommend without much thought. The thought, it turns out, mattered. The average primary care visit in the United States lasts between 15 and 17 minutes. That number has been fairly stable for decades, despite the increasing complexity of both medicine and the patients who require it. Into those 15 minutes must fit greeting and establishing rapport, reviewing the reason for the visit, taking a history, conducting a physical examination as warranted, reviewing existing medications and recent test results, arriving at a diagnosis or differential, discussing treatment options, writing any necessary prescriptions or referrals, and completing the electronic health record documentation that has become a defining feature of modern medical practice, and which physicians report spending on average as much time on as they spend in direct patient contact. 15 minutes is not enough time to do all of that well. 15 minutes is in fact barely enough time to do any one of those things at the depth that a genuinely complex medical situation requires. And yet, the system is built around it, because 15 minutes is what the reimbursement structure supports, and the reimbursement structure is not designed around what patients need. It is designed around what insurers will pay per visit code, which are 2 very different things, and the gap between them is where a remarkable amount of harm quietly accumulates In this context, the prescription pad has structural advantages. It is fast. It provides immediate visible action. The patient came in with a problem and is leaving with a tangible response. It satisfies an expectation that has been shaped over decades of advertising and cultural conditioning toward medication as the primary language of medical care. Studies have found that physicians who believe their patients expect a prescription are significantly more likely to write one, regardless of whether they believe it is the optimal treatment, and that physicians are not reliably accurate in their assessments of what their patients actually expect. A meaningful percentage of patients who receive a prescription they didn't need would, if asked directly, have been happy with a thorough explanation and a plan that didn't involve medication. Pharmaceutical companies have understood this dynamic for decades and invested accordingly. The practice of pharmaceutical detailing, sending sales representatives to physicians' offices with samples, literature, and sometimes gifts or meals was, until regulations tightened in the 2000s, an enormous industry organized around a simple insight. The most powerful influence on a prescribing decision is the last conversation a physician had about the drug in question. If that conversation was with someone paid to present the drug favorably, and the physician has 17 minutes before the next patient in a waiting room that is currently 6 patients behind, the prescription gets written. None of this indicts individual physicians. Most are doing their genuine, effortful best inside a structure that was not optimized for their best. It does suggest that the conversation you have in the exam room, the one about what you're taking and why and for how long and what the exit looks like, is one you may need to drive more than you were told to expect. The United States and New Zealand are the only 2 developed nations in the world that permit pharmaceutical companies to advertise prescription drugs directly to consumers. Every other wealthy democracy has decided, for reasons that are not difficult to articulate, that this is not a good arrangement. The reasoning is fairly straightforward. These are powerful compounds with complex risk profiles, approved on the basis of scientific evidence that most patients cannot evaluate, and the decision to use them should be driven by clinical judgment rather than a television commercial featuring middle-aged people in linen shirts enjoying sunset kayaking. The United States arrived at its current arrangement in 1997, when the FDA relaxed the rules governing broadcast pharmaceutical advertising. Previously, drug ads were largely confined to medical journals and professional publications, communications to physicians, not patients. After the rule change, the floodgates opened. Within a decade, pharmaceutical companies were spending billions annually on direct-to-consumer advertising. The drugs most heavily advertised were not necessarily the most effective or the most needed. They were the most profitable. Lifestyle drugs, blockbuster medications with massive patient populations, drugs for conditions that could be framed in ways that resonated with a broad television audience. The ads follow a recognizable structure. A person in mild distress. Something wrong, but not alarmingly so. The tone is hopeful, not catastrophic. A named drug. A montage of restored normalcy. The backyard barbecue attended, the grandchildren chased, the workday managed. The emotional resolution of the before and after, and then, in the final seconds, the mandated recitation of risks, delivered at a pace calibrated to satisfy the regulatory requirement while minimizing the cognitive impact on the viewer. Side effects may include nausea, dizziness, suicidal thoughts, liver damage, allergic reactions, including death. The music is still playing. The golden retriever is still running. Research on the effects of direct-to-consumer advertising is consistent. It increases prescription rates for advertised drugs, sometimes significantly, independent of whether those drugs are the most clinically appropriate option for the patients requesting them. It shapes the expectations patients bring into the appointment. It narrows the conversation in the exam room from what is the best treatment for your condition to, is this specific drug appropriate for you? A different question with a different default answer, and it directs marketing spend toward the drugs that generate the most revenue for the company, which is not the same criterion as the drugs that generate the most benefit for the patient. These are not the same list. They overlap. They are not the same list. Since the late 1990s, over 500,000 people in the United States have died of opioid overdoses. That number is larger than the American military death toll of World War II. It is larger than the combined death tolls of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, and all Gulf conflicts combined. It is a number large enough to populate a mid-sized American city, to fill every seat in every Major League Baseball stadium simultaneously, to represent, if you laid the deaths end-to-end chronologically, one person dying every 10 minutes for over 2 decades. That is what the number means, abstractly, and abstraction is precisely the problem with numbers like this. The opioid epidemic, a term that has become so familiar it risks sounding like a piece of furniture, unfolded in distinct phases that are worth naming separately, because they affected different people in different ways, and the tendency to discuss them as a single event has obscured both the causes and the responses. The first wave, running roughly from the mid-90s through the early 2000s, was driven almost entirely by prescription opioids, OxyContin and its relatives, flowing from pharmaceutical companies through compliant prescribers into communities that had legitimate pain and no particular reason to distrust what a doctor recommended. This wave was heaviest in Appalachia, in rural communities with high rates of physical labour, in places where the economy had contracted and the bodies had followed. The second wave began around 2010 as prescription opioids became harder to obtain, through prescription drug monitoring programs, through reformulated pills harder to abuse, and people who had become dependent on prescription opioids turned to a cheaper, more available alternative, heroin. The death toll from heroin rose sharply. Then the third wave arrived. Fentanyl infiltrating the heroin supply, then the cocaine supply, then the methamphetamine supply, then pressed into counterfeit pills so convincing that a person buying what they believed was a pharmaceutical oxycodone from a dealer was actually buying something 50 times more potent, with no way of knowing the difference and no margin for error in finding out. Each death in those numbers is a specific person, not a statistic, a person with a name and a birthday, and people who called them something particular, Mum or Mike, or the one who always laughed too loud. A person who, in most cases, did not set out to become addicted to anything. A person who went to a doctor, or a dentist, or a surgery, or who found something at a party, or who was already in pain and found something that made the pain stop, and then discovered that the stopping had a cost no one had clearly quoted them in advance. The numbers don't capture that. The numbers are just where we start. No prescription drug exists in isolation inside the human body. This seems obvious when you say it plainly, and yet the architecture of American healthcare has historically been poor at accounting for it. Not because doctors don't understand pharmacology, but because the system was not built to see the whole patient. It was built to see the appointment, the chief complaint, the prescription, the follow-up, the full picture of what a person is taking, from how many providers, through how many pharmacies, with what interactions occurring in a liver that was never consulted about the arrangement, has frequently been invisible to the people who needed to see it most. The average Medicare patient in the United States is on 5 or more prescription medications simultaneously. A meaningful percentage, studies have estimated between 30 and 40% of older adults, are on 10 or more. Each of those drugs was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, tested and approved individually. The clinical trials that established safety and efficacy for drug A did not include patients also taking drugs B, C, D, and E, because including polypharmacy patients and trials complicates the data and slows the process. The number of potential interactions between 10 drugs is not 10. It is not even close to 10. It is an exponential combinatorial space that no clinical trial has mapped, and no individual physician carries comprehensively in their working memory. Some drug interactions are well known, carefully monitored, and managed with precision. Warfarin's interaction with dozens of common medications is a standard part of anticoagulation management. The dangerous combination of benzodiazepines and opioids, both respiratory depressants, both capable individually of causing fatal breathing suppression, and together capable of doing so at doses that neither would achieve alone, has received a black box warning. These are the known knowns. The problem is the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, the interactions that are suspected but understudied, and the ones that nobody has connected yet because the signal is buried in data that isn't being systematically reviewed. There is a class of drug interactions called pharmacokinetic interactions that operate through a family of liver enzymes called cytochrome, P450, CYP450 for short. Many drugs are metabolized by these enzymes. Some drugs inhibit the enzymes, meaning that other drugs metabolized by the same pathway accumulate to higher concentrations than expected. Some drugs induce the enzymes, meaning other drugs are metabolized faster and fall below therapeutic levels. Grapefruit juice inhibits a specific CYP450 enzyme called CYP3A4, which metabolizes roughly 50% of all pharmaceutical drugs. The warning on certain medications to avoid grapefruit is not fussiness. It is a genuine pharmacokinetic interaction that can result in drug levels significantly higher than prescribed. The elderly are most vulnerable because they metabolize drugs more slowly, are most likely to be on multiple medications, are most likely to have seen multiple specialists who may not be communicating with each other, and are most likely to have conditions, kidney disease, liver disease, reduced albumin, that alter how drugs behave in the body. The interaction that sends a 78-year-old to the emergency room is often not dramatic. It is the quiet arithmetic of several reasonable prescribing decisions made independently, adding up to something none of the individual prescribers intended. The story of prescription drugs in America is not the same story for everyone. It never has been. The pills are the same. The pharmacology is the same. The addiction, when it comes, is the same neurological hijacking, the same helplessness, the same desperate arithmetic of a brain that has been reorganized around a substance and cannot easily reorganize itself back. But who gets prescribed what, in what quantities, with what warnings, with what access to treatment afterward, that is not the same. That has never been the same, and understanding the opioid crisis, or any pharmaceutical crisis, without understanding that asymmetry is like trying to read a map with half the geography removed. Start with pain. Pain management in the United States has been shaped, for decades, by a persistent and medically unfounded belief that black patients feel less pain than white patients, that their pain tolerance is higher, their nervous system somehow different, their reports of suffering less credible. This is not an ancient prejudice buried in historical footnotes. It is a belief documented in studies published as recently as 2016, present in a meaningful percentage of medical students and residents, influencing treatment decisions in emergency rooms and primary care offices across the country right now. A 2016 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found that half of first and second year medical residents endorsed at least one false belief about biological differences between black and white patients, including the belief that black people have less sensitive nerve endings. These beliefs have no basis in human biology. They have an enormous impact on who receives adequate pain treatment. This means that during the prescription opioid wave of the 90s and 2000s, black patients were systematically prescribed opioids less frequently than white patients with equivalent pain presentations. In rural and predominantly white communities devastated by the influx of OxyContin and its successors, the drug flowed through medical channels with a confidence and volume that was not extended to communities of colour. This was not protection. Being undertreated for pain is not a benefit. It is a different category of harm, one that does not show up in overdose statistics, but shows up in suffering, in diminished function, in the particular injury of being in pain and being disbelieved. When the opioid crisis became visible as a public health emergency, when the deaths accumulated enough to demand a policy response, when congressional hearings were held and budgets were allocated and a national conversation began about addiction as a disease rather than a moral failure, the population at the centre of that conversation was predominantly white. The response, such as it was, reflected that. Harm reduction programs, naloxone distribution, medication-assisted treatment, the rhetorical reframing of addiction, away from criminality. These advances, however incomplete, arrive for communities that had been seen as sympathetic. People who had trusted their doctors and been betrayed, people with families and jobs and mortgages who had become addicted through no fault of their own. A different framing from the one that had governed the crack cocaine crisis of the 1980s, when the response was incarceration rather than treatment, and the population at the centre of the crisis was not predominantly white. Then fentanyl arrived in the illicit supply and the geography of overdose shifted. Black and indigenous communities, already without the harm reduction infrastructure that had been assembled elsewhere, began dying at sharply increasing rates. Native American communities saw overdose mortality rise faster than any other demographic group in the late 2000 teens and early 2020s. The same system that had denied them opioids in clinical settings now had nothing adequate to offer them in the crisis. Class runs alongside race through all of this in ways that are inseparable and occasionally distinct. Geography matters. Rural communities with limited healthcare infrastructure, high rates of physically demanding labour, reduced economic opportunity, and limited access to behavioural health services have been disproportionately affected at every stage of the crisis. The prescription that started the chain was often written by a doctor who was the only doctor for miles. The addiction treatment centre, if it existed, might be a 2-hour drive away and not covered by the insurance available through a part-time service job. The naloxone that could reverse an overdose was not always in the house of the person who needed it. The gap between the resources required to survive addiction and the resources available to the people most affected by it has been consistent, and it has not been accidental. Who gets which pills and why is a medical question with a deeply political answer. And the answer, read carefully, is a map of who has been seen and who has not, who has been believed and who has not, who's been treated as a patient and who has been treated as something else. The pharmacology doesn't make those distinctions. The system does. Naloxone, sold under brand names including Narcan and Cloxardo, is one of the more remarkable substances in modern medicine, for a reason that is both straightforward and, when examined closely, quietly astonishing. It saves lives by doing almost nothing, except getting in the way. It is an opioid antagonist, meaning it binds to opioid receptors with high affinity, but without activating them. It occupies the receptor, blocks the opioid that is causing the overdose from binding, and in doing so rapidly reverses the respiratory depression that is killing the person in front of you. A nasal spray, an injection. In the right hands, in the right moment, administered within a narrow window of time, it is the difference between a phone call to say someone is in the hospital and a phone call to say someone is not coming home. Naloxone has been available since the 1960s. It has been a standard tool in emergency medicine for decades, in ambulances, in emergency rooms, carried by paramedics as routinely as a tourniquet. For most of that history, it was available only to medical professionals on the reasoning, or at least the stated reasoning, that its use required clinical training and professional oversight. For most of that history, opioid overdose was not occurring primarily in settings where medical professionals were present within the window of time when naloxone is most effective. It was occurring in homes, in cars, in bathrooms, in the company of people who loved the person overdosing and had no idea what to watch for and nothing to do when they saw it. The push to make naloxone more broadly available to first responders beyond paramedics, to community organisations, to pharmacists who could dispense it without a prescription, to the families and friends and roommates of people who used drugs, began in earnest in the late 90s and early 2000s, driven by harm reduction advocates, public health researchers, and the families of people who had died in circumstances where naloxone in the house would have meant survival. The resistance to that push was, in retrospect, remarkable for both its consistency and its logic, which did not hold up well under examination. Some law enforcement officials argued that making naloxone available would send a message that drug use was acceptable, that reversing an overdose was a form of enabling. Some legislators expressed concern that knowing an overdose could be reversed would reduce the deterrent effect of the risk of dying. These arguments were made while people died. They were made in congressional testimony and in state legislative hearings, and in the kind of language that sounds like policy reasoning until you examine what it is actually saying, which is that the threat of death should remain available as a behavioural incentive, and that removing it, saving the life of someone in the middle of an overdose, represented an unacceptable message to send. The medical and public health community responded with data. Studies in communities where naloxone had been distributed widely showed no increase in drug use and significant decreases in overdose mortality. The evidence was not ambiguous. The resistance continued anyway, in some quarters for years, because the argument was never really about evidence. It was about who deserved to be saved and under what conditions and what they ought to have done differently first. Gradually, access expanded. Most states moved to allow pharmacists to dispense naloxone without a prescription. Community organisations trained laypeople to recognise and respond to overdoses and distributed naloxone kits. First responder programs equipped police officers, often the first on the scene of an overdose, ahead of paramedics, with the drug. In 2017, the Surgeon General issued an unprecedented public advisory recommending that more Americans carry naloxone. In 2023, the FDA approved an over-the-counter version available without any prescription at all, a decision that should have come decades earlier and arrived for many families too late. The debate over naloxone access is, in concentrated form, the debate over how American society understands addiction, as a medical emergency requiring a medical response, or as a consequence to be experienced and survived or not, depending on choices made and the moral weight attached to them. The drug itself has no opinion on this. It just works when it gets there in time, and the only question that ever mattered was how to make sure it did. The circularity of this particular story is almost too elegant to have been invented, except that it cost too many people too much for anyone to have written it on purpose. It is the kind of narrative arc that, if you submitted it as fiction, an editor might send back with a note suggesting it was too on the nose, too obviously structured, too neatly illustrative of its own theme. And yet here it is, documented in pharmaceutical archives and congressional testimony and medical journals and the death certificates of 500,000 people, unreturned. Heroin was not born in a back alley, it was born in a laboratory in 1897. A chemist at Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, the one that gave the world aspirin, synthesized diacetyl morphine while searching for a less addictive alternative to morphine, which had by then produced enough cases of dependence to make the medical community nervous. The new compound was found, in animal testing, to produce morphine-like effects at lower doses. A researcher at Bayer, Heinrich Drieser, administered it to himself, and reported that it made him feel heroic. The compound was named heroin. It was marketed by Bayer beginning in 1898 as an over-the-counter medication. It was sold in pharmacies. It was recommended for coughs, bronchitis, and tuberculosis. It was prescribed to children. It was advertised in the medical literature of the time as a safer, non-habit-forming alternative to morphine and codeine. It was considered among physicians a genuine therapeutic advance. You know how that ended, but it is worth sitting with it. Because the gap between the confidence of the initial marketing and the reality that accumulated over the following decade is identical, in structure if not in scale, to the gap between what Purdue Pharma said about OxyContin in 1996 and what the death certificate said 10 years later. Heroin was restricted in the United States under the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 and effectively prohibited in 1924. It became a street drug, expensive, dangerous, socially coded as a problem of poverty and marginalization and moral failure, a narrative that conveniently obscured its pharmaceutical origins and made it easier to respond with criminalization rather than public health. Decades later, OxyContin and the broader prescription opioid boom created something that had not existed at that scale before. A large population of people physically dependent on opioids, who had accessed their dependence through legitimate medical channels, and who then, as those channels were tightened, needed somewhere to go. Heroin was cheaper than diverted prescription pills and more available. The transition from prescription opioids to heroin, documented in survey data, tracked in emergency room visits, visible in the epidemiological literature with painful clarity, was not a mystery. It was a predictable response to a supply disruption in a population with a physical need that did not resolve when the prescription ran out. Then fentanyl entered the supply. Cheaply manufactured in illicit laboratories, extraordinarily potent, easily transported in quantities too small to detect with standard law enforcement methods. Fentanyl was initially cut into heroin, and then, progressively, replaced it. The heroin supply in the United States is now predominantly fentanyl. What is sold as heroin is largely fentanyl. What is pressed into counterfeit oxycodone pills is largely fentanyl. What showed up in the cocaine and methamphetamine supplies, sometimes deliberately, sometimes as contamination, sometimes as the result of manufacturing conditions that made separation impossible, is fentanyl. The drug that Bayer invented to replace morphine, that became heroin, that was prohibited and criminalized and driven underground, that was rediscovered by pharmaceutical companies in a new form, that created a new generation of dependence through medical channels, that drove people to the street drug supply, that was then displaced by a synthetic compound 50 to 100 times more potent. That is not a story with a villain. It is a story with a system. And the system is still running. The use of psychiatric medications in children and adolescents is one of the most consequential and least publicly examined areas of modern medicine. Not because the drugs don't work, some do for some children, in meaningful ways. Not because childhood mental illness isn't real, it is prevalent, and the suffering it produces is genuine and deserving of serious treatment. But because the gap between how confidently these medications have been prescribed and how well they have been studied in pediatric populations is a gap that has rarely been stated plainly to the parent sitting across from the prescriber, nodding and trusting that the recommendation in front of them rests on the same foundation of evidence as a recommendation for an antibiotic. It does not. Not always. Sometimes significantly not. The reason is structural and, once understood, infuriating in the quiet way that things are infuriating when they result from decisions nobody in particular made and everybody in general allowed. Clinical drug trials are expensive, time-consuming and ethically complex when they involve children. Pediatric patients cannot consent for themselves. dosing is complicated by the rapidly changing pharmacokinetics of a developing body. Regulatory frameworks historically did not require manufacturers to study drugs in children before approving them for adults, and the incentive to go back and run pediatric trials after adult approval was limited. The drug was already on the market, already being prescribed to children off-label by clinicians making their best guesses, and the additional trial would cost money without opening new markets, so the trials often didn't happen. Stimulants for ADHD, Adderall, Ritalin, Vivance have more pediatric data than most psychiatric medications, partly because the initial target population was children, and partly because the diagnosis has been studied for decades. But even here, the data on long-term effects of stimulant use on the developing brain is considerably thinner than the confidence of the prescription would suggest. Short-term efficacy is well established. What regular amphetamine exposure does to dopaminergic development in a brain that hasn't finished building itself, that question has not been answered to the satisfaction of everyone asking it, and it has not been answered because the studies that would answer it take decades, and nobody funded them with appropriate urgency. Antidepressants in children and adolescents are a more fraught territory. SS are prescribed widely to young people for depression and anxiety, and for some they are genuinely helpful. But in 2004, the FDA issued a black box warning, its most serious, noting that antidepressants were associated with an increased risk of suicidal thinking and behavior in children, adolescents, and young adults up to age 24. Not completed suicide, in the trial data, suicidal ideation, a distinction that matters pharmacologically, but that is less comforting to a parent than it sounds on paper. The warning was, and remains, controversial within psychiatry. Some argue that untreated depression poses a greater suicide risk than the medication, which is true. Some argue that the warning discouraged prescribing and led to undertreated adolescent depression, which may also be true. The argument can be correct and still not resolve the underlying question, which is, did we know enough about what these drugs were doing in adolescent brains before we gave them to millions of adolescents? The honest answer is that we did not, and we knew we did not, and the prescribing happened anyway. Antipsychotics prescribed to children, for mood disorders, for behavioural problems, sometimes for diagnoses made in circumstances that would not survive rigorous scrutiny, carry side effect profiles that in an adult would prompt careful discussion and regular monitoring, and that in a child, whose metabolic and neurological systems are still developing, carry implications that are not fully understood. The weight gain associated with some atypical antipsychotics can be dramatic and rapid in children. Metabolic effects accumulate. The conversation that should precede that prescription, the one that is honest about what is known, what is unknown, and what the alternatives are, is not always the conversation that happens in a 50-minute appointment with a family that is exhausted and frightened and willing to try almost anything. Before the first antipsychotic changed the landscape of psychiatric treatment, what happened to people with severe mental illness in institutional settings was not medicine, in any sense that would be recognizable as such from where we stand now. The tranquilizer chair, a device that immobilized patients completely, used in American asylums in the early 19th century under the reasoning that physical restraint reduced nervous excitement, was among the more defensible options. Patients were also subjected to prolonged immersion in cold water baths, to induced insulin comas intended to produce a kind of neurological reset, to various surgical interventions based on theories about infection causing madness, and to the transorbital lobotomy performed with an instrument resembling an ice pick, inserted through the eye socket, swung to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the brain, performed by Walter Freeman in doctors' offices, and even in a converted van, he drove around the country, sometimes on patients who had not given meaningful consent, and sometimes on patients whose primary diagnosis was depression or anxiety, that simply hadn't responded to anything else. Freeman performed over 3,500 lobotomies in his career. He was celebrated for much of it. Medical history is not always where you expect to find lessons about the long-term consequences of confident intervention in a system not yet understood. When chlorpromazine arrived in the early 1950s and demonstrated that it could reduce psychotic symptoms, the hallucinations, the delusions, the disorganized thinking, without physically destroying brain tissue or inducing unconsciousness, it was received in context as an almost miraculous advance. Psychiatric wards that had been loud, chaotic, and managed through restraint became quieter. Patients who had been unreachable became reachable. Conversations became possible. The drug did not cure schizophrenia. It managed it in a way that allowed some patients to leave institutions, live outside, maintain something like a life. For those patients, and for the people who cared for them, this was transformative. But something else happened alongside the therapeutic revolution, something that would take decades to fully recognize. The biological model of psychiatric illness, the idea that disordered behavior and thought were the product of chemical imbalances correctable with chemical intervention, expanded far beyond the conditions it had originally addressed. Depression became a serotonin problem. Anxiety became a GABA problem. ADHD became a dopamine problem. Each of these framings captured something real and left out something important, and the pharmaceutical industry, which had an obvious financial interest in the expansion of the biological model, invested substantially in the infrastructure of that expansion, in advertising, in research funding, in continuing medical education, in the shaping of diagnostic categories. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, the book that defines what counts as a psychiatric diagnosis, expanded across its successive editions in ways that broadened the population eligible for psychiatric treatment. Conditions that had been defined narrowly became defined broadly. Thresholds for diagnosis were lowered. New categories were added. This is not a conspiracy. It is a complex process involving many clinicians with genuine intentions operating inside a system with structural pressures. But the outcome is a diagnostic framework that has made more people eligible for psychiatric medication at every revision, and a pharmaceutical industry positioned to respond. The result is a culture in which medication has become the primary language of mental health treatment, not because psychotherapy, behavioral intervention, social support, and environmental change don't work, but because they are slower, harder to scale, less reimbursed, less measurable, and impossible to patent. The pill is easier to fit into 15 minutes. The pill has a brand name and a direct-to-consumer campaign. The pill is what most people expect when they walk into an appointment and describe what is happening in their mind. The system has been extraordinarily good at meeting that expectation. It has been considerably less good at asking whether the expectation is always the right one. In 1970, with the counterculture in full disruptive bloom, and the Nixon administration looking for legislative tools to manage it, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. The law established a tiered scheduling system for regulating drugs based on two criteria: their potential for abuse and their accepted medical use. 5 schedules, running from Schedule 1, high abuse potential, no accepted medical use, down to Schedule 5, low abuse potential, accepted medical use, available with fewer restrictions. The framework had logic. It also had politics woven into it from the beginning, in ways that have produced consequences echoing for over 50 years. Schedule 1 is where the law's most consequential decisions live. Drugs in Schedule 1 are, by legal definition, considered to have no accepted medical use in the United States and a high potential for abuse. They cannot be prescribed by physicians. Research on them requires special licenses and extraordinary bureaucratic difficulty. The practical effect of a Schedule 1 classification is not just restriction, it is near complete suppression of legitimate scientific inquiry, because the regulatory barriers to studying a Schedule 1 substance are high enough that many researchers simply work on something else. Cannabis is Schedule 1. This is the federal classification of a substance that is, as of the time of this recording, legally prescribed as medicine in the majority of American states, sold recreationally in a significant number of them, and used by tens of millions of Americans for conditions ranging from chronic pain to nausea to anxiety to seizure disorders. The Schedule 1 classification, which officially holds that cannabis has no accepted medical use, exists in a legal and scientific parallel universe to the reality of how the substance is actually used and studied. The federal classification has not been updated to reflect 50 years of research, state-level medical programs, or a mounting body of evidence about therapeutic applications. It reflects a political decision made in 1970 that has proven remarkably durable. Psilocybin, the psychoactive compound in magic mushrooms, is also Schedule 1. This classification coexists with a growing body of rigorous clinical research conducted at Johns Hopkins NYU, Imperial College London and elsewhere, suggesting that psilocybin-assisted therapy may be among the most effective treatments ever studied for treatment-resistant depression, end-of-life anxiety, and addiction. Single-session treatments producing significant lasting improvements, outcomes that compare favourably with anything currently in the psychiatric pharmacopoeia. The research is not preliminary, it is Phase 2 trial level. The FDA has granted psilocybin breakthrough therapy designation, meaning it acknowledged the evidence was compelling enough to fast-track the approval process, and yet the substance remains Schedule 1, meaning the research continues under conditions so bureaucratically constrained that the pace of development bears no relationship to the urgency of the conditions it might treat. Fentanyl is Schedule 2, so is cocaine. Schedule 2 means high abuse potential but accepted medical use, meaning these substances can be prescribed, manufactured, and distributed through pharmaceutical channels. The scheduling does not track danger in any straightforward way. It tracks a political history, the decisions made by the Nixon administration about which drug problems belong to which populations, which substances were associated with the counterculture, and which with medicine, which users deserved criminal consequences and which deserved prescriptions. Understanding the schedule means understanding that it was never purely scientific, and that the consequences of its distortions have been distributed very unevenly. In 2019, Purdue Pharma filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code. The filing was, in structure, a fairly standard corporate maneuver, a company facing overwhelming liability seeking the protection of a court to manage its debts in an orderly way. In context, it was something else, the formal acknowledgement that the company whose marketing of OxyContin had contributed to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans could not pay its way out from under that history, and was going to court to manage the terms of what it owed, and to whom. The Sackler family had owned Purdue Pharma privately for generations. This is the detail that matters most to the legal and moral architecture of what followed. Because Purdue was privately held, the wealth it generated flowed directly to the family, not to shareholders who could be separated from the company's conduct, not to a diffuse ownership structure that could argue ignorance or distance. The Sacklers received an estimated $10 to $12 billion in distributions from Purdue between 1996 and the company's bankruptcy. They received this money while internal company documents that would later be obtained through litigation and made public, showed that Purdue was aware of patterns of abuse, addiction, and diversion associated with OxyContin, and made decisions about how to respond that prioritized market protection over patient safety. In the years before the bankruptcy filing, as litigation mounted and the scale of the liability became clearer, the family transferred substantial sums out of Purdue into protected accounts, trusts and foreign holdings. The transfers were legal. They were also, in the view of attorneys general across the country, a deliberate effort to place assets beyond the reach of the litigation that was coming. When the bankruptcy proceedings began, attorneys for the states and the families of victims found themselves arguing against a structure designed to limit what the family could be required to pay. The settlement that emerged was, to many of the people most affected, deeply unsatisfying. The Sacklers agreed to contribute billions from their personal fortune, figures that varied across successive negotiations in exchange for broad legal immunity from future civil claims related to OxyContin. The immunity provision was the sticking point. Families of overdose victims argued that a family that had not declared bankruptcy should not be able to use bankruptcy proceedings to immunize itself from lawsuits. The legal question went to the Supreme Court, which in 2024 ruled narrowly on the structure of the immunity provision. The museums and universities and hospitals that bore the Sackler name, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, Oxford, the Guggenheim, the Smithsonian, Harvard, began, over several years and after significant public pressure, to remove it. The family had donated generously, and the donations had been accepted generously, and the names had gone up on buildings, and for years the buildings had been quieter about the source of the money than the plaques suggested. Institutions have memories that are selective in ways that track power. They remember the gift. They are slower to remember where it came from. What accountability looks like for pharmaceutical harm, real accountability, at a scale that matches the damage, remains an open and largely unanswered question. The lawsuit settled. The name came down from some of the walls. The number on the death certificates did not change. Addiction is a chronic brain disease. This is the consensus of every major medical and scientific organization that has examined the evidence: the American Medical Association, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the National Institutes of Health, the World Health Organization. It is not a moral failing. It is not a weakness of character. It is not what happens to people who didn't try hard enough, or love their families enough, or want it badly enough. It involves lasting, measurable changes to the brain's reward circuitry, stress response systems, and prefrontal executive function. Changes that can persist for months or years after drug use stops, that make relapse far more likely than willpower-based models of recovery suggest, and that respond to treatment the same way other chronic conditions respond to treatment. Imperfectly, over time, with maintenance, with setbacks, and with a recovery arc that looks less like a single transformative moment, and more like the careful, ongoing management of something that will require attention for a long time. This is not a controversial position in medicine. It has not been controversial in medicine for decades. It remains, somehow, controversial in the systems and structures and cultural attitudes that surround medicine, in insurance billing departments, in legislative chambers, in the treatment programs that turn people away for relapsing, in the families that interpret a relapse as evidence that the person didn't want to get better badly enough. The gap between what science says addiction is and how society treats the people who have it is one of the most consequential gaps in American healthcare, and it is filled, in the space between those two positions, with an enormous amount of preventable death. Medications exist to treat opioid use disorder, and they work. Methadone has been used since the 1960s, when Vincent Dole and Marina Swanda demonstrated at Rockefeller University that it could stabilize patients who had been cycling through heroin use and withdrawal, allowing them to function, maintain employment, and live outside institutions. Methadone reduces cravings. eliminates withdrawal symptoms, and through a mechanism called cross-tolerance, substantially reduces the rewarding effect of additional opioid use. Decades of research have confirmed that it reduces overdose deaths, reduces drug use, reduces criminal activity, improves family stability, and extends lives. Buprenorphine, a partial opioid agonist sold under brand names including Suboxone and Subutex, works through a similar mechanism with a ceiling effect that makes it safer to prescribe outside of highly supervised settings. Naltrexone, available in daily oral form and as a monthly injectable called Vivitrol, blocks opioid receptors entirely, eliminating the pharmacological reward of opioid use. All three medications are supported by evidence so consistent and so long established that describing them as experimental would be medically illiterate. The availability of these medications bears no meaningful relationship to where the epidemic has been most devastating. Consider the geography. Rural counties in West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, counties where overdose death rates have reached levels that, in a different context, would be described as mass casualty events, have in many cases been without a single buprenorphine prescriber within a reasonable driving distance. The regulatory requirement that created this gap was the X waiver, a separate training and registration process, beyond standard medical licensure, required to prescribe buprenorphine for opioid use disorder. The requirement was based on a concern, legitimate in origin, disproportionate in application, that buprenorphine would be diverted and misused, and so a medication that could prevent overdose deaths was placed behind a bureaucratic barrier that reduced the number of providers willing to obtain the additional credential in a field that was already severely undersupplied. The X waiver was finally eliminated in 2023, and the barrier came down. The deaths that occurred in the interval between when the barrier was identified as a problem and when it was removed are not recoverable. Insurance coverage for addiction treatment has improved since the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2008 required that addiction treatment be covered at the same level as other medical conditions. It has improved on paper more than in practice. Ongoing investigations by state attorneys general and federal agencies have documented systematic violations of parity requirements, insurers applying more restrictive prior authorization requirements to addiction treatment than to equivalent medical and surgical care, limiting the duration of residential treatment below what clinical evidence supports, requiring step therapy protocols that force patients through treatments known to be less effective before authorizing the ones known to work. Prior authorization for addiction medication is not an administrative inconvenience. In a condition where the gap between treatment and relapse is measured in hours, a required waiting period for authorization is a clinical risk. Some people do not survive the wait. And then there is the cultural residue, the decades of framing addiction as moral failure, the imagery of the addict as someone who chose this, someone who could stop if they really wanted to, someone whose situation reflects something about their character rather than something about their brain chemistry and their circumstances and the pharmacological properties of the substances they encountered. That residue shows up in treatment programs that still reject medication-assisted treatment as insufficiently clean, in communities where the stigma of being on Suboxone rivals the stigma of being on heroin, in the word junkie still used without apparent awareness of the weight it carries. It shows up in the family dinner table and the employer's office and the judge's chambers. The medication works, the shame does not. The research on this is thorough, consistent, and has not notably changed the culture. The gap between the evidence and the attitude is still wide enough to fall through, and people do. The opioid crisis was not an accident. This is the sentence that makes what comes next harder to approach with straightforward hope. and it is worth sitting with before moving to the ways the future might look different. Because the ways the future might look different require understanding what they are up against, and optimism that doesn't account for the structure of the problem is not optimism. It is distraction with better lighting. The system that produced the opioid crisis was not a malfunction. It functioned exactly as designed. It was designed to generate pharmaceutical profit within a regulatory framework that evaluated safety and efficacy in conditions, short trials, selected populations, industry-funded research, limited post-market surveillance that were genuinely not adequate to detect the harms that would emerge at scale over time in the complicated pharmacological reality of real human lives. The design was not secret. The inadequacies were known. They were known to researchers, to regulators, to pharmaceutical company scientists who understood the gap between a controlled trial and the world their drug was about to enter. The design persisted because the financial incentives within it were extraordinary, and the penalties for the harms it produced were, historically, not large enough relative to the revenue to function as meaningful deterrents. Purdue Pharma paid significant fines before the bankruptcy. It continued marketing OxyContin aggressively after those fines. The calculation was rational given the numbers. The numbers were the problem. What has changed? Some things, genuinely. Prescription drug monitoring programs, the systems that allow prescribers and pharmacists to see a patient's controlled substance history across providers, are now operational in all 50 states and have produced measurable reductions in certain prescribing practices associated with high overdose risk. The FDA's Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategies program, known as REMS, requires additional safety measures for certain high-risk drugs. The opioid prescribing guidelines issued by the CDC in 2016, updated in 2022, have shifted prescribing culture in ways that are visible in the data. These are real changes. They are also downstream changes in how drugs are used after approval, rather than changes in the conditions under which drugs are evaluated and approved in the first place. The upstream architecture is largely intact. The emerging science around psychedelic medicine represents something that deserves attention without premature enthusiasm, because the history of premature enthusiasm about new drug classes is precisely what this entire script has been about. Psilocybin-assisted therapy has produced outcomes in clinical trials for treatment-resistant depression and end-of-life anxiety that compare favourably with anything in the current psychiatric pharmacopoeia. MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD reached Phase 3 trials before the FDA declined to approve it in 2024, citing concerns about trial design and the difficulty of blinding in psychedelic trials, and researchers are working to address those concerns. Ketamine, in its pharmaceutical form as esketamine, is approved and being used for treatment-resistant depression. These compounds work through mechanisms entirely different from the drugs that preceded them, and that difference may matter. The experience of the treatment, a guided, intensive, therapeutically structured encounter with the drug, rather than a daily maintenance medication, is also structurally different in ways that may reduce some of the dependency and tolerance dynamics that have plagued other psychiatric drugs. But the pharmaceutical industry is forming around these compounds in real time. The patents, the clinical trial ownership, the pricing discussions, the lobbying to ensure that psychedelic therapy flows through channels that maximize reimbursement, all of this is already in motion. The compounds are new. The system processing them is not. What they become will depend in part on whether the lessons of the opioid era are genuinely incorporated into how the next generation of powerful psychiatric drugs is developed, approved, monitored, and made accessible. The researchers working on these treatments are, by and large, aware of that history and serious about not repeating it. Whether the regulatory and commercial structures around them will allow the caution that awareness calls for is a different question and not yet answered. What comes after the opioid era is, in part, already here, in the fentanyl supply, in the methamphetamine crisis that has run parallel and received a fraction of the political attention, in the benzodiazepine overdose deaths that have risen steadily and quietly, while the policy conversation focused elsewhere. The next chapter is being written in the same structures that wrote the last one, by some of the same people, under some of the same pressures. The question of whether it ends differently is open. The answer will be found not in the pharmacology, which has always been honest about what it does, but in whether the human systems built around it are finally willing to be. Here, at the end, is the part that is not history. It is not policy or pharmacology, or the long record of institutional failure measured in death certificates and congressional settlements. Here, at the end, is the part that is just you specifically, at whatever hour this is, in whatever room you're in, thinking about the bottle in the medicine cabinet, or the prescription you were handed last week, or the question you've been meaning to ask your doctor and keep not quite finding the right moment for, because the appointment is short and the doctor seems busy and you don't want to be the patient who asks too many questions. This part is for that. You are allowed to ask too many questions. You are in fact the entire reason the questions matter. The most important thing this history suggests, taken as a whole, from the thalidomide disaster to the OxyContin settlements, to the Ambien sleep driving reports, to the Xanax withdrawal nobody warned you about, is this. The information you need to make a genuinely informed decision about your own medical care is more available to you than the structure of the system tends to make it feel. The asymmetry of expertise between a physician and a patient is real, meaningful, and not an argument against trusting your doctor. It is, however, an argument against mistaking a signed prescription for a complete conversation. The box being checked on the informed consent form is not the same thing as you understanding what you're agreeing to. Both things can happen. They often don't. So here are the questions. Write them down if that helps. Take them to the appointment, not as a challenge, but as a contribution, as the kind of engaged, specific participation in your own healthcare that every good prescriber actually wants, and that the system has not always made easy to offer. Ask what the drug is doing in your body, not the soft version, the mechanism, what it binds to, what it changes, what the downstream consequences are. A prescriber who understands the drug can explain this in terms that are accessible without being condescending. If the explanation you receive is it helps with your anxiety, or it helps with your pain and nothing more, that is an invitation to ask the next question. Understanding the mechanism is not pedantry. It is how you understand the risk profile, because the risks follow directly from the mechanism, and the mechanism is the honest version of the advertisement. Ask how long you will need the drug and what the plan is for stopping. This question, asked before the first prescription, is the question that has most often been missing from the appointments that preceded a crisis. Ask whether stopping will be straightforward, or whether it will require a taper. Ask over what timeline the taper should happen, and what you can expect to feel during it. Ask whether there is a documented discontinuation syndrome for this class of drug and how common it is. For benzodiazepines, for opioids, for certain antidepressants, the answer to this question is substantially more complicated than the prescription label implies, and you deserve to know that before you start rather than after. Ask about drug interactions. Tell your prescriber everything you take, every prescription from every provider, every over-the-counter medication, every supplement, every vitamin, every substance used with any regularity. Do not assume your prescriber already knows. Providers who practice in different systems do not automatically share records. Supplements are not routinely reviewed as medications, even though many have significant pharmacological activity. The pharmacist at your pharmacy is a resource that most patients use as a checkout clerk, and a professional who are specifically trained in pharmacokinetics and drug-drug interactions. Ask them. They will not find it unusual. They will find it refreshing. Ask about non-pharmacological options, not as a way of refusing medication, but as a way of understanding the full landscape of what is available for your condition. For depression and anxiety, the evidence for psychotherapy, particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, is extensive and in many outcomes comparable to medication for mild to moderate severity, with a durability advantage that medications don't always share. For insomnia, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, consistently outperforms sleeping pills in long-term studies and produces improvements that persist after treatment ends, which is not what the pharmacological data on sleeping pills shows. For pain, physical therapy, movement-based approaches, and psychological pain management strategies have evidence behind them that is not always presented with the same confidence as a prescription pad. None of this is an argument against medication. It is an argument for knowing the menu before you order. Ask what the evidence looks like specifically. How large were the trials? How long did they run? Were they conducted in people with your characteristics, your age, your sex, your other medical conditions, your other medications? Was the research funded by the company that makes the drug, and does the independent replication support the same conclusions? These questions are not always answerable in a 15-minute appointment, but asking them signals something important, that you understand your care is being delivered within a system, and that systems have interests that are not always identical to yours, and that the gap between those interests is worth watching. The pharmaceutical system, for everything documented across these 30 segments, the marketing dishonesty, the regulatory gaps, the communities destroyed, the families bereaved, the accountability deferred and diluted and occasionally avoided entirely, also contains people who went into medicine because suffering troubled them and they wanted to be useful against it. Researchers who spent careers understanding mechanisms because the mechanisms were genuinely fascinating and the applications genuinely mattered. Clinicians who sit with difficult patients in difficult circumstances and try, with the tools available to them, to help. The history does not indict them. It describes the structure around them and asks whether the structure is serving the people inside it or the interests above it. The pill in your pocket may be exactly right for you. It may be the thing that makes the morning manageable, the thing that gives you back a life that pain or illness had taken, the thing that your brain actually needed and that medicine was right to provide. That is a real possibility. It is also a real possibility that it is a question you haven't finished asking yet, sitting in a bottle with a label that was written carefully and did not say everything. Either way, you are allowed to know. You're always allowed to know. The asking is not the problem. The not asking, quietly, politely, trustingly, in a 15-minute appointment that moved on before you thought of the question, that is what the history has cost. So ask. You are the whole point. So here we are, at the end of a long night. You have travelled through 500,000 deaths and a boardroom in Connecticut. Through a Belgian chemist who synthesized something too powerful for the margin of error available to him. Through a rat poison that became a lifesaver that became, in the wrong hands on the wrong night, the thing that sent someone to the emergency room. Through sleeping pills that drove cars nobody was steering. Through antidepressants that were harder to stop than anyone told you they would be, and stimulants invented for soldiers that ended up in backpacks, and benzodiazepines prescribed to mothers in the 1970s for feelings that didn't have names yet, and a single stubborn woman at the FDA who said the data wasn't good enough and was right, and was called obstructionist for it, and was eventually given a medal that weighed considerably less than the lives she saved. That is a lot of ground to cover before sleep, and yet here you still are, which means something, even if you're not sure what yet. Let's take a breath. Because before this becomes a story about systems and failures, and the cold arithmetic of preventable death, and it is that story, and it always will be. It is also a story about something else, something that runs underneath all of it, quieter and harder to name. It is a story about pain, real pain, the kind that wakes you at 3 a.m. and sits on your chest and does not respond to breathing exercises or positive affirmations or the suggestion that you might feel better if you went for a walk. The kind that lives in the lower back of a man who's been doing physical labour since he was 17 and cannot stop, because stopping means the mortgage doesn't get paid. The kind that lives in the mind of a woman who cannot leave the house some days because the fear arrives before she does. The kind that lives in the body of a child who cannot sit still, cannot focus, cannot understand why everyone else seems to find ordinary things so much easier, and is beginning to believe the problem is something essential about who he is. Every drug in this story was invented for that pain, not for the profit, though the profit came, not for the marketing campaign, though the campaign followed. At the origin of every compound we talked about tonight, the poppy extract, the accidentally discovered benzodiazepine, the amphetamine salt, the serotonin reuptake inhibitor, there was a researcher looking at someone suffering and wanting genuinely to help. That does not excuse what happened afterward. It does not soften the deaths or restore what was lost. But it matters. In the same way it matters that the medieval peasant banking the fire at 3 a.m. wasn't failing at survival. They were fighting for it, with everything available to them, in the conditions they had. The people who developed these drugs were, in most cases, doing the same. The failure was not in the trying. It was in the structures that surrounded the trying and shaped what happened next. The 500,000 people who died of opioid overdoses in the United States did not die because medicine failed to care about them. Some of them died because medicine cared about the wrong things, measured by the wrong metrics, within a system that was rewarded for the transaction rather than the outcome. Some of them died in the gap between what was known and what was disclosed. Some of them died in the space between a prescription that ran out and a treatment program that had a 6-week waiting list. Some of them died in a county without a single licensed prescriber of the medication that could have saved them, a county that had been chosen decades earlier by a pharmaceutical sales territory map as a high-value market for the drug that started the chain. They did not die because they were weak. They died in a system that was strong in the wrong directions and weak in the ones that mattered. And the people who survived, who are still surviving, who are in recovery right now in a million different shapes and forms and circumstances, some with medication, some without, some through community, some through faith, some through sheer bloody-minded refusal to let the thing win. Those people are doing something that deserves more than the word resilience, which has been used so many times it has started to sound like an excuse for not fixing the conditions that require it. They are not resilient in the way a rubber band is resilient. They are resilient in the way a human being is resilient, which is messier and more expensive and more dependent on other people than the rubber band version, and infinitely more worth honouring. Tonight, as you settle into whatever warmth you have arranged around yourself, the blanket, the pillow, the fan making its soft white noise in the corner, the particular weight of the bed that has learned the shape of you over time, maybe spare a thought for the researchers who spent careers in the honest pursuit of less suffering. For the FDA reviewer who held her ground in 1962 and spared this country a disaster it never had to know the full dimensions of. For the addiction medicine physicians working in rural counties with inadequate resources and patients on every waiting list. For the harm reduction workers handing out naloxone in parking lots at midnight. For the families who stayed. For the families who lost someone and channeled that loss into advocacy, into testimony, into the long, unglamorous work of trying to make the system different than it was. And maybe, gently, without blame, just as information, spare a thought for the bottle in your bathroom cabinet, for what is in it, and why, and whether you, know the answers to the questions we talked about tonight. Not urgently, not tonight, not at this hour, not in a way that disturbs the quiet you have worked to arrange, but soon, in daylight, with a pen and a doctor who has enough time, because you deserve the full story about what you're putting in your body. You always did. And the fact that the full story was sometimes withheld, was sometimes buried in fine print, was sometimes recited too quickly over piano music, while a golden retriever ran through a field that was not acceptable. And you knowing that it was not acceptable is, quietly, the beginning of something better. The history of prescription drugs is not a history of villains, though villains appear in it. It is not a history of incompetence, though incompetence contributed. It is a history of human beings trying to solve pain in a system that was not designed primarily around the people in pain, and of what happens when the gap between that design and that need is wide enough and long enough and profitable enough to become catastrophic. But history is not destiny. The system that produced the crisis is not immutable. The conversation is different now than it was in 1996, and different in ways that were purchased at great cost by people who refused to let the death toll be the end of the story. That matters. That is worth carrying into sleep. So close your eyes now. The questions will keep until morning. The world will keep until morning. And you, here, still at the end of all of this, you are the reason any of it matters. Sleep well.